The calm before the storm. The boarding lounge at Kennedy International Airport buzzed with energy typical of early evening departures. Business professionals, families, and solo travelers filled the spacious terminal, their conversations blending into a low hum beneath the announcements crackling over the PA system. Naomi Price, a pregnant woman in her mid-30s, sat quietly by the window with her 6-year-old daughter, Amara, perched beside her. Naomi, dressed in a comfortable but chic maternity sweater and jeans, glanced at her boarding pass, which confirmed her first-class seat for Flight 883 to Dallas. Amara sat engrossed in a picture book, her curly hair bouncing as she leaned in closer to the colorful pages. Naomi's calm demeanor masked the exhaustion from a grueling day. She had traveled from a legal conference where she presented her findings on workplace discrimination, a subject close to her heart and professional expertise. Now, all she wanted was a quiet flight home, where her husband was waiting eagerly to celebrate their anniversary. When the boarding announcement for first-class passengers was made, Naomi took Amara's hand and approached the gate. A polite attendant scanned her ticket and offered a courteous smile. "Have a pleasant flight, Mrs. Price." Naomi returned the smile, appreciating the warm professionalism, but as she moved toward the jet bridge, she noticed a second attendant standing near the entrance. The woman, whose name read Linda Blake, had a stony expression as she watched Naomi approach. Naomi offered a nod, but Linda's response was a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Naomi let it slide. She had long grown accustomed to such reactions, those fleeting moments where judgment seeped through the cracks of a person's demeanor. But her focus remained on Amara, who clung to her hand with excitement. "Are we really sitting at the front of the plane, Mommy?" Amara asked in awe. "Yes, sweetheart," Naomi said with a soft laugh, her free hand gently patting her growing belly. "It's going to be a comfortable ride for all of us." Upon entering the cabin, the ambience of luxury was a welcome reprieve from the chaos of the terminal. Plush leather seats, soft lighting, and attentive attendants created an atmosphere of serenity. Naomi found their assigned seats -4A and 4B, and settled in, placing her carry-on beneath her seat. Amara clambered into her seat by the window, her face pressed against the glass as she admired the planes taxiing below. Linda appeared moments later, her presence disrupting Naomi's tranquility. "Excuse me, ma'am," Linda said, her voice clipped. "May I see your boarding pass?" Naomi blinked, surprised. "Of course," she replied, retrieving the pass from her bag. She handed it over, her smile unwavering despite Linda's terse tone. Linda inspected the pass with scrutiny, her eyes darting from the paper to Naomi. She handed it back with an icy demeanor. "Thank you," she said curtly before walking away. Naomi sighed, brushing it off as overzealous protocol. She turned her attention to Amara, helping her adjust her seatbelt. Moments later, Linda reappeared, this time with an even more rigid posture. "Mrs. Price," she said, her voice now laced with authority, "could you step to the front for a moment? There seems to be an issue with your ticket." Naomi's brows furrowed. "An issue? I confirmed these seats weeks ago. Is there a problem?" "It's just a quick check," Linda replied, her tone dismissive. "Please bring your belongings." Passengers nearby began to notice the exchange, their gazes flicking toward Naomi with curiosity. Amara's hand tightened around her mother's. Naomi crouched to reassure her daughter, whispering, "Stay here for a moment, sweetie. Mommy will be right back." Naomi stood, gathering her bag and straightening her shoulders. She followed Linda to the galley near the plane's entrance, her steps deliberate and measured. She wasn't one to be easily intimidated, but the situation felt oddly personal. Linda stopped abruptly, folding her arms. "I need to verify your ticket with the gate staff," Linda said, avoiding Naomi's gaze. Naomi frowned. "I've already shown you my ticket. What exactly needs verifying?" Before Linda could answer, 2 uniformed police officers appeared in the doorway, their presence sucking the air out of the room. Passengers gasped audibly, and several craned their necks to get a better view. "Is there a problem here?" one officer asked, his tone professional but firm. Linda gestured toward Naomi, her expression smug. This passenger may be occupying a first-class seat that wasn't properly assigned to her. Naomi's breath caught, but her composure held firm. She met the officer's gaze directly. "I've provided my boarding pass. It's valid. I'd like an explanation for why this is being escalated." The officer took Naomi's pass and examined it carefully. After a moment, he looked up, his brow furrowed. "This pass is valid," he said, his voice carrying an undertone of disapproval as he turned to Linda. "What exactly is the issue?" Linda faltered, her smugness giving way to visible discomfort. "I wasn't sure," she stammered. "It just didn't seem right." The officer's jaw tightened. Didn't seem right based on what? Passengers were now openly recording, their phones aimed at the unfolding scene. Naomi stood tall, her silence speaking volumes as she refused to dignify Linda's baseless assumptions with a reaction. 5 minutes later, the situation would take a dramatic turn that would leave everyone speechless. 5 minutes that changed everything. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin shifted from tranquil luxury to palpable unease. Conversations that once hummed softly faded into silence as passengers observed the commotion near the galley. Phones were discreetly lifted, their tiny cameras catching every detail of the unfolding drama. Naomi Price stood tall, her calm composure a stark contrast to the escalating tension around her. The two officers exchanged a glance, clearly displeased with how they'd been summoned. One of them, Officer Daniels, a tall man with a measured demeanor, turned to Linda Blake, the flight attendant who had called them. His voice was sharp but controlled. "Let's clarify something, Ms. Blake. What prompted this call? You claim there was an issue with this passenger's boarding pass, but it's valid. Did you have another reason?" Linda flushed, her earlier confidence unraveling. She fidgeted with the hem of her uniform, her eyes darting to the passengers who were now openly staring. "It's not that, officer," she stammered. "I thought she might not have purchased the seat herself. I mean, it's first class. And what?" Daniels pressed, his tone hardening. "You made an assumption. That's not a policy violation. It's a judgment call. A bad one." Naomi remained silent, her expression composed but steely. Her silence wasn't passive. It was deliberate, forcing those around her to confront their own discomfort. Inside, however, her heart pounded. Not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. This wasn't the first time she'd been subjected to such treatment, and it likely wouldn't be the last. The second officer, a woman named Rivera, stepped forward. Her tone was gentler but carried authority. "Ma'am," she said, addressing Naomi directly, "you're not under any suspicion. If you're comfortable, you can return to your seat. We'll handle this matter here." Before Naomi could respond, a new figure entered the scene. A woman in a crisp navy blue suit, her badge prominently displayed on her lapel, strode down the aisle. She was the flight supervisor, Janet Cooper, and her arrival was met with immediate deference from the cabin crew. "What's going on here?" Janet demanded, her sharp gaze sweeping over the scene. Her tone left no room for excuses. Linda opened her mouth to explain, but Naomi interjected, her voice steady yet laced with quiet authority. "It seems I didn't look like someone who belongs in first class, and that was enough for Ms. Blake to escalate matters to this point." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, her calm delivery amplifying their weight. Janet's eyes flicked to Linda, narrowing. "Is this true?" she asked coldly. Linda fumbled, her earlier bravado now replaced with a mix of panic and shame. "I thought there might have been a mistake," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. "A mistake," Janet repeated, her tone dripping with disbelief. "So, instead of discreetly verifying information, you called law enforcement and humiliated a passenger in front of everyone." Linda's silence was deafening. The supervisor turned to Naomi, her expression softening slightly. "Mrs. Price, I deeply apologize for this incident. It's unacceptable, and I'll ensure it's addressed appropriately. Please, return to your seat and we'll make sure you're as comfortable as possible for the rest of the flight." Naomi nodded once, her composure unwavering. She walked back to her seat, her daughter looking up at her with wide, curious eyes. "Mommy, are we leaving?" Amara asked, her voice filled with confusion. "No, sweetie," Naomi said, her tone gentle. "We're staying right here. Everything's fine." But everything wasn't fine, not for Linda. The supervisor wasted no time addressing her. "Ms. Blake, you've crossed every line of protocol we have in place. Pack your things. You're relieved of duty for this flight, effective immediately." Passengers murmured in astonishment. Some even clapped, their applause muted but unmistakable. Linda looked as though she might protest, but ultimately nodded, her face pale as she retreated to the galley to collect her belongings. As Linda disappeared, Janet turned to the police officers. "Thank you for your assistance, but your presence is no longer required. I'll be filing an incident report with the airline, and this will be escalated to the highest level." Daniels nodded, his expression neutral but tinged with frustration. "Understood. If you need additional statements, you know where to find us." As the officers left, Janet stood in the aisle, her presence commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, addressing the passengers, "on behalf of the airline, I deeply apologize for the disruption you've witnessed. We take incidents like this seriously and will address it with the utmost urgency." Passengers murmured their approval, though the tension in the cabin remained thick. Naomi could feel their eyes on her, some filled with sympathy, others with discomfort. She took a deep breath, focusing on calming her daughter, who had resumed flipping through her book, blissfully unaware of the weight of the situation. Back in the galley, Linda sat on a stool, her hands trembling as she texted her partner. "I've messed up. I might lose my job." She hit send, but no immediate reply came. Her mind raced through potential excuses, ways to salvage her reputation. But deep down, she knew the damage was done. As the flight continued, Naomi pulled out her notebook and began jotting down the details of the incident. Times, phrases, the names of the officers, every moment meticulously recorded. She wasn't just documenting this for herself. She was preparing to ensure no one else endured what she had. The power of silence. The plane cruised smoothly at 35,000 feet, but the first-class cabin was anything but serene. A mix of discomfort, curiosity, and quiet outrage hung in the air like a storm cloud. Naomi Price, seated back beside her daughter Amara, focused on her child's chatter about the fluffy clouds outside. Outwardly, she appeared calm, but her mind was racing. The minutes since the confrontation with Linda Blake had felt like hours. Naomi had dealt with prejudice in subtle and overt forms throughout her life. Yet the audacity of what had transpired, the public humiliation, the unjust assumptions, stirred something deeper in her. This wasn't just about her dignity. It was about accountability. Across the aisle, a man in his 50s glanced at Naomi, hesitated, then leaned slightly forward. His salt and pepper hair framed a face lined with concern. "Excuse me," he said softly. "I just wanted to say I admire the way you handled yourself back there." "That couldn't have been easy." Naomi gave him a small, polite smile. "Thank you. I've had practice." The man nodded, seemingly unsure how to respond. After a brief pause, he added, "It's unbelievable that this sort of thing still happens." "It is," Naomi replied, her tone measured but firm. "But it's also not surprising." The man's expression darkened. He nodded again before retreating into his seat. Naomi returned her attention to Amara, who was carefully coloring in her sketchbook, blissfully unaware of the weight surrounding her mother. Naomi envied her daughter's innocence, but she also felt a deep responsibility to protect it. In the galley, Linda sat on a folding chair, her uniform crumpled and her face pale. She clutched her phone tightly, staring at the screen. Messages from friends and family blinked unread. She had hoped to send an apologetic text to her partner, but every draft felt insufficient. What could she say? "I assumed the worst about someone and embarrassed them. And myself. in front of a plane full of people. Her supervisor's words still rang in her ears. "Pack your things. You're relieved of duty for this flight." Linda had never been disciplined before. She had prided herself on her professionalism. But now, all she felt was shame. A younger flight attendant, Clara, entered the galley to prepare drink trays. She glanced at Linda, her expression a mix of pity and quiet disapproval. Clara had witnessed the incident but had kept her distance, not wanting to get involved. Now, as she restocked the cart, she finally spoke. "You really messed up, Linda," she said softly, not unkindly. "Why did you do it?" Linda looked up, her eyes red. "I don't know," she admitted. Something didn't feel right." Clara frowned. Something didn't feel right, or someone didn't look right. Linda winced at the pointed question. "I didn't mean for it to blow up like this," she said defensively. "I thought I was doing my job." "Your job," Clara said slowly, "is to ensure passengers are safe and comfortable, not to judge them based on how they look. You called the police on a pregnant woman sitting with her child. How do you think that looks?" Linda didn't respond. Clara sighed, shaking her head, as she wheeled the cart out into the cabin. Naomi glanced up as Clara approached. "Would you like anything to drink, ma'am?" Clara asked gently. "A water for me, please," Naomi said. She glanced at Amara. "And apple juice for her." Clara nodded, her movements efficient yet thoughtful. When she returned with the drinks, she lingered for a moment. "I just want to say," she began hesitantly, "I'm really sorry for what happened earlier. That wasn't right, and it's not how we're supposed to treat our passengers." Naomi studied the young woman for a moment. There was no defensiveness in her tone, only sincerity. "Thank you," Naomi said simply. "I appreciate you saying that." Clara gave a small nod and moved on. Naomi watched her go, her mind churning. The incident wasn't isolated. It was a symptom of something larger. The airline needed to take responsibility, not just for Linda's actions, but for the culture that allowed them to happen. In the back rows of economy class, murmurs about the incident continued to spread. A young woman scrolling through social media gasped and turned to her seatmate. "Oh my God, look at this," she whispered, showing her phone. Someone had uploaded a video of the confrontation with Linda, and it was already going viral. The video's caption read, "Flight attendant humiliates pregnant woman. Police called for no reason." Passengers around her leaned in, watching the video with a mix of shock and anger. "That's disgusting," one man said, shaking his head. "What was she thinking?" "I hope she gets fired," another woman muttered. Back in first class, Naomi's phone buzzed on the tray table. She unlocked it to find a flood of notifications. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers had sent her messages of support. Some had seen the video. Others had heard about the incident through word of mouth. One message stood out, a text from her legal contact, Mia. "Naomi, I saw the video. Let's discuss next steps when you land. This needs to be addressed publicly and formally." Naomi sighed, setting the phone aside. She had expected the story to spread, but the speed at which it was gaining traction was staggering. While she appreciated the support, she knew the attention came with risks. She had no intention of becoming a media spectacle, but she also couldn't let this incident be swept under the rug. As the flight continued, Naomi reached for her notebook. She began documenting the event in meticulous detail, the times, the words exchanged, the actions taken. She wrote not just for herself but for Amara, for every passenger who had witnessed the injustice, and for those who might face similar treatment in the future. Her resolve solidified with every word she wrote. This wasn't just about accountability for Linda or even the airline. It was about challenging a system that allowed prejudice to fester unchecked. Naomi wasn't just a passenger. She was a force for change. As the plane began its descent, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and all carry-on items are stowed." Naomi looked at Amara, who was now asleep with her stuffed toy clutched tightly. She brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead, her heart heavy yet determined. She thought of the countless stories she had heard in her career as a civil rights attorney, stories of people who had been judged, dismissed, or mistreated simply for existing. This would not be just another story. Naomi would ensure that. As the plane touched down, a quiet determination settled over her. The battle had only just begun. The storm on the ground. The plane touched down with a smooth glide, but for Naomi, the real turbulence was only beginning. Passengers began to unbuckle their seatbelts, the familiar sound of clicks echoing through the cabin. Overhead compartments opened with hurried hands, suitcases and bags spilling into the aisles. Amid the usual bustle, Naomi remained seated, her hand resting protectively on Amara's shoulder. She observed the subtle shifts around her. Sideways glances from nearby passengers, whispered conversations that halted whenever she looked up. Despite the discomfort, Naomi remained poised. This wasn't the first time she had been under scrutiny, but it might be the most public. In the galley, Linda Blake was packing her belongings with trembling hands. Her supervisor, Janet Cooper, stood nearby, her arms crossed and her expression steely. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" Janet asked, her voice low but firm. Linda nodded mutely, her face pale. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. "You called law enforcement on a passenger without cause," Janet continued. "You didn't just overstep, you shattered protocol. The repercussions of this won't stop with a simple apology, Linda. I hope you realize that." Linda's head dipped further, her shame evident. The words she wanted to say, excuses, apologies, justifications, felt hollow, even to her. She gathered her belongings and exited the plane through the back, avoiding the main cabin and the piercing gazes of passengers. Naomi waited patiently as the passengers around her filtered out. Clara, the young flight attendant, approached cautiously. "Mrs. Price," she said softly, "the captain would like to speak with you before you disembark. Would you mind waiting a moment?" Naomi raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "Of course," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. The other passengers cleared the aisles, their eyes flicking toward Naomi, with a mix of curiosity and sympathy. Some murmured quiet words of support as they passed her seat. "You handled that with such grace," one woman said softly, pausing for a moment. "I don't think I could have stayed so composed." Naomi offered a polite smile but said nothing. Words of encouragement were welcome, but they wouldn't change what had happened. As the last passenger exited, the captain appeared, his uniform crisp and his demeanor apologetic. He approached Naomi with a hand extended. "Mrs. Price," he began, "I'm Captain Edwards. I wanted to personally apologize for what happened on this flight. It was unacceptable, and I assure you that steps will be taken to address it." Naomi stood, shaking his hand firmly. "Thank you, Captain," she said, her tone measured. "I appreciate your words, but an apology isn't enough. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It's part of a larger problem, and I intend to make sure it's addressed." The captain nodded, his expression somber. "I understand. I've already submitted a report to headquarters, and our management team will be reaching out to you directly. If there's anything I can do in the meantime, please don't hesitate to let me know." Naomi nodded once, gathering her bag and taking Amara's hand. As she walked toward the exit, the weight of the day pressed against her, but so did her resolve. This was far from over. The terminal was alive with its usual chaos. Travelers rushing to their gates, announcements echoing overhead, and families reuniting near the baggage claim. Yet, as Naomi stepped off the plane, a different kind of energy buzzed around her. Dozens of phones were pointed in her direction, their owners whispering amongst themselves. The video of the incident had already spread like wildfire, and Naomi found herself the unwilling center of attention. Amara clutched her hand tightly, looking up at her mother with wide, questioning eyes. "Why are they all looking at us, Mommy?" she asked. Naomi knelt down to her daughter's level, smoothing her hair. "Sometimes people pay attention when something important happens," she explained gently, "but it's nothing for you to worry about." "Okay." Amara nodded, her trust in her mother unshaken. As Naomi approached the baggage claim area, she felt her phone buzz in her bag. She retrieved it to find a flood of notifications, texts, emails, and social media mentions. One email stood out, a formal response from the airline's public relations department. Subject: immediate follow-up on Flight 883 incident. Dear Mrs. Price, on behalf of Horizon Air, I want to extend our deepest apologies for the incident that occurred during your flight. We are conducting a thorough investigation and will ensure the appropriate actions are taken. Please expect further communication from our executive team regarding how we plan to address this matter. Sincerely, Karen Monroe, Director of Public Relations, Horizon Air. Naomi read the email with a critical eye. It was carefully worded, an acknowledgement of the incident without taking full accountability. She forwarded it to her legal contact, Mia, with a short note. Predictable PR move. Let's prepare our response. She was about to put her phone away when a call came in. It was Mia. Naomi, Mia began, her voice sharp but sympathetic. I saw the video. This is bigger than we thought. It's already trending on multiple platforms, and media outlets are reaching out for statements. I figured as much, Naomi replied. But I want this to be more than a headline, Mia. I don't just want them to apologize. I want systemic changes. Policies, training, accountability. This has to mean something. Agreed, Maya said. I'm drafting a formal complaint. When you get home, we'll strategize. We'll make this count. Naomi ended the call and turned her attention back to Amara, who was now playing with her stuffed toy, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. As Naomi retrieved her suitcase from the carousel, she noticed a group of airline employees huddled nearby, whispering and casting nervous glances in her direction. Among them was Janet Cooper, the flight supervisor, who approached Naomi cautiously. "Mrs. Price," Janet began, her tone earnest, "I want to reiterate how sorry I am for what happened. I filed a detailed report with management, and I assure you, Linda's actions don't reflect the values of our airline." "Thank you, Ms. Cooper," Naomi replied, her voice calm but firm. "But this isn't just about Linda. It's about the culture that allowed her to act the way she did. Words are nice, but actions are what matter." Janet nodded, visibly chastened. "You're absolutely right. I'll make sure your concerns are escalated." As Naomi turned to leave, she noticed a young woman standing nearby with a notepad and microphone. The woman hesitated before stepping forward. "Mrs. Price," she said, "I'm a reporter with Channel 12 News. Would you be willing to comment on what happened during your flight?" Naomi paused, considering the request. She glanced at Amara, who looked up at her with curious eyes. This wasn't a decision she could make lightly. Her story could spark meaningful change, but it could also expose her and her daughter to further scrutiny. "I'll speak when the time is right," Naomi said finally, her tone resolute. "Right now, my priority is my daughter." The reporter nodded, stepping back respectfully. Naomi adjusted her bag, took Amara's hand, and walked toward the exit. The buzz of the terminal faded behind her, but the storm surrounding the incident was far from over. The ripple effect. By the time Naomi and Amara reached their car at the curbside pickup, the storm of attention surrounding the incident had grown beyond anything Naomi could have anticipated. The videos recorded by passengers had gone viral, spawning hashtags and igniting debates across social media platforms. News outlets were already publishing headlines dissecting the event. Naomi, however, maintained her focus. As she helped Amara into her car seat and secured the buckle, she glanced at her phone again. Notifications flashed incessantly. Friends and colleagues had sent messages of support, while strangers offered encouragement and shared their outrage. Naomi knew she couldn't ignore the growing momentum, but she also had to navigate it carefully. Once she settled into the driver's seat and started the car, Amara spoke up from the back. "Mommy, why were those people taking pictures of us?" she asked, her voice tinged with innocent confusion. Naomi met her daughter's gaze in the rearview mirror, her heart aching for the simplicity of her child's world. "Sometimes people see something unfair and want to share it so others can understand," she explained. "But you don't need to worry about any of that. Sweetheart, Mommy will take care of it." Amara nodded, satisfied with the answer, and returned her attention to her stuffed toy. As Naomi drove home, her mind raced with plans. The incident wasn't just personal, it was systemic. She had been given a platform, however unwillingly, and she intended to use it wisely. That evening, Naomi sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her. Amara was upstairs, tucked into bed after a bedtime story and a warm cup of milk. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rustle of papers as Naomi reviewed her notes. Her phone buzzed with another incoming call. It was Mia, her legal contact. "I've got the formal complaint drafted," Maya said without preamble. "It outlines the incident, Linda Blake's actions, and the airline's response, or lack thereof. I've also included recommendations for policy changes, including mandatory diversity training for staff and clear escalation protocols to prevent this kind of incident." "Good," Naomi said. "What about public pressure? This isn't just about my complaint. It's about forcing them to take real accountability." Mia hesitated. "It's already happening. Social media is on fire, and news outlets are picking up the story. But we need to be strategic. If you're willing, I'd suggest doing a controlled interview with a reputable outlet, someone who will focus on the bigger picture, not just the sensationalism." Naomi considered this. She had always preferred to work behind the scenes, fighting battles in courtrooms and boardrooms rather than the public eye. But this wasn't just about her. It was about the countless people who had faced similar discrimination without the platform to fight back. "Let's set it up," she said finally. "I'll do the interview, but I want to control the narrative. This isn't about me. It's about change." The next morning, the sun streamed through the windows as Naomi sipped her coffee and scrolled through her phone. Overnight, the hashtags had gained even more traction. Celebrities, activists, and everyday people were weighing in, sharing their own experiences with discrimination and calling for the airline to take action. One particular tweet caught Naomi's attention. It was from a well-known civil rights leader. "Naomi Price's experience on Flight 883 is a stark reminder of how far we still have to go. Discrimination has no place in our skies, or anywhere else. At Horizon Air, the world is watching." The airline had issued another statement, this time from the CEO. While it was more comprehensive than their initial response, it still felt like damage control. Statement from Horizon Air CEO. "We deeply regret the incident that occurred on Flight 883 involving Mrs. Price and one of our employees. Discrimination of any kind goes against our values as a company. We are conducting a full investigation and are committed to taking immediate action to ensure this does not happen again." Naomi shook her head. "Empty words," she muttered. She forwarded the statement to Mia with a note. "Let's keep pushing." Later that day, Naomi arrived at the downtown office of a prominent news outlet where she was scheduled to give an exclusive interview. The producer greeted her warmly, guiding her into a well-lit studio. Amara had stayed home with her father, allowing Naomi to focus entirely on the task ahead. The interviewer, a respected journalist named Diane Hayes, approached her with a handshake. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Price," Diane said. "I know this can't be easy, but your voice is important." Naomi nodded, taking her seat. "I just want to make sure this isn't reduced to a spectacle," she said. "This is about more than one flight attendant's actions. It's about the culture that allows these assumptions to thrive." Diane gave her an encouraging smile. "That's exactly why we're here." The cameras rolled, and Diane began the interview with a brief recap of the incident. She then turned to Naomi. "Mrs. Price, can you walk us through what happened on Flight 883? Naomi recounted the events with precision, her tone calm but unwavering. She described Linda's assumptions, the escalation to law enforcement, and the humiliation of being questioned in front of her daughter. "What went through your mind during those moments?" Diane asked. "I thought about my daughter," Naomi replied. "I thought about what kind of world she's growing up in and how I want her to know that her worth isn't defined by someone else's prejudice. I stayed calm because I wanted her to see that dignity is stronger than ignorance." Diane nodded, visibly moved. "What do you hope will come from this?" "I hope this becomes a turning point," Naomi said firmly. "Not just for Horizon Air, but for every company, every institution, every individual who thinks it's acceptable to judge someone based on preconceived notions. It's time for real accountability and systemic change." Meanwhile, behind the scenes, at Horizon Air's headquarters, the legal and PR teams were in full crisis mode. The CEO had called an emergency meeting to address the growing backlash. Executives debated strategies, from issuing more apologies to offering Naomi a settlement to keep the matter quiet. But the viral nature of the incident made silence impossible. The videos, the hashtags, the media coverage, it was a PR nightmare that couldn't be contained. "What's our next move?" one executive asked, his voice fraught with tension. The CEO's expression was grim. "We implement real changes," she said finally. "Diversity training, new protocols, transparency, and we reach out to Mrs. Price directly. If we don't handle this right, we'll lose more than just public trust. We'll lose our credibility as a company." As the interview aired later that evening, Naomi watched from her living room. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Messages poured in from people around the world, some thanking her for her bravery, others sharing their own stories of discrimination. Naomi felt the weight of those stories, but she also felt hope. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was a movement. The interview aired during prime time, a half-hour segment that quickly captured national attention. Diane Hayes, known for her incisive yet empathetic interviewing style, had skillfully brought Naomi's story into focus without sensationalizing it. The segment ended with Diane looking directly into the camera and saying, "This is not just Naomi Price's story. It's a reflection of the biases that persist in our society. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" As the credits rolled, the impact was immediate. On social media, the hashtags associated with the incident skyrocketed to trending status. Hashtag Justice for Naomi and hashtag Flying While Black became rallying cries, with thousands of people sharing their own stories of discrimination while traveling. Some were as harrowing as Naomi's. Others were subtler, but no less telling. Naomi sat on her couch, her laptop open, and phone buzzing relentlessly with notifications. Messages poured in, some from complete strangers, others from prominent figures in activism, law, and the media. Her husband, Marcus, entered the living room carrying a mug of tea. "It's all over the news," he said, setting the tea down beside her. "People are furious." "They should be," Naomi replied, scrolling through her email. She paused on a message from Horizon Air's CEO, a follow-up to their earlier public statement. Subject: Follow-up from Horizon Air leadership. "Dear Mrs. Price, first and foremost, I want to extend my deepest apologies for the incident on Flight 883. As CEO of Horizon Air, I take full responsibility for ensuring that our policies and practices reflect the values we claim to uphold. We are implementing the following immediate actions: a full internal review of our diversity and inclusion training programs, mandatory retraining of all cabin crew on de-escalation and anti-discrimination protocols, the establishment of a passenger advocacy council to address concerns and improve accountability. I would like to invite you to meet with our executive team to discuss additional steps we can take to ensure this never happens again. Your input would be invaluable in helping us grow from this moment. Sincerely, Margaret Yates, CEO, Horizon Air. Naomi handed the laptop to Marcus. Damage control, she said, her voice tinged with skepticism. They're trying to save face. Marcus read the email carefully. Maybe, but they're offering to meet with you. That's a start. Naomi leaned back, her fingers tapping the edge of her mug. If I do this, I need guarantees, real changes, not just empty promises. They need to feel the weight of this. Marcus nodded. And they will, because you won't let them off the hook. The broader impact. While Naomi contemplated her next move, the ripple effect of her story continued to grow. News outlets picked up the interview, replaying clips of Naomi's calm yet powerful responses. Think pieces and opinion columns flooded the internet, dissecting the broader implications of the incident. Some criticized Horizon Air's initial handling of the situation, while others praised Naomi for her grace under pressure. In communities across the country, conversations sparked by Naomi's experience became catalysts for deeper discussions about systemic bias and accountability. Grassroots organizations began citing her case in their campaigns, using it as a rallying point to demand better corporate policies and practices. Even within Horizon Air, the incident had triggered an internal reckoning. Employees at all levels, pilots, flight attendants, ground staff, grappled with the reality of what had happened. Some felt ashamed, others felt vindicated, having long suspected that their company's diversity initiatives were more performative than substantive. Clara, the young flight attendant who had shown kindness to Naomi during the flight, found herself thinking about the incident constantly. She had always prided herself on treating passengers with respect, but witnessing Linda's actions had forced her to confront the gaps in her own training. She sent Naomi a private message through social media. Mrs. Price, I just wanted to thank you for how you handled everything on Flight 883. You stayed strong when most people wouldn't have. I hope the airline takes this as seriously as they should. If there's anything I can do to support your efforts, please let me know. Naomi read the message and smiled faintly. Clara's sincerity was a small but meaningful reminder that change often started with individuals. Preparing for the meeting. 3 days after the interview aired, Naomi received a formal invitation to meet with Horizon Air's executive team at their corporate headquarters. Mia accompanied her, both as her legal representative and trusted friend. The meeting was scheduled in a sleek glass conference room, with a view of the city skyline that seemed almost deliberately chosen to convey transparency. Margaret Yates, the CEO, greeted Naomi personally, her demeanor a mix of professionalism and humility. Mrs. Price, thank you for agreeing to meet with us, Margaret began, gesturing for Naomi and Mia to take their seats. I want to assure you that we're committed to making meaningful changes. Naomi nodded, her expression neutral. I hope that's true. Because what happened on that flight wasn't just about one employee's actions. It was about a culture that allowed those actions to seem acceptable. Margaret winced slightly but nodded. You're absolutely right. That's why we're not treating this as an isolated incident. We've already begun implementing new training protocols and reviewing our hiring practices to ensure greater diversity and sensitivity. Mia spoke up. That's a good start. But we need specifics. What metrics are you using to measure the effectiveness of these changes? How will you ensure accountability at every level of your organization? The discussion continued for over an hour, with Naomi and Mia presenting their demands: transparency in reporting progress, partnerships with civil rights organizations, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. By the end of the meeting, Naomi felt cautiously optimistic. We'll be watching closely, Naomi said as she stood to leave. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been dismissed, judged, or silenced. You have an opportunity to set an example. Don't waste it. That evening, back at home, Naomi tucked Amara into bed, her heart lighter than it had been in days. As she sat on the edge of her daughter's bed, Amara looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. Did you fix it, Mommy? Amara asked. Naomi smiled, brushing a curl from her daughter's forehead. "Not yet," she said, "but we're on our way." Amara nodded sleepily, her trust unwavering. "You're the best, Mommy." As Amara drifted off, Naomi sat quietly for a moment, reflecting on everything that had happened. The fight wasn't over, but she had taken the first steps toward turning an injustice into a catalyst for change. And for the first time in days, she allowed herself to feel hopeful. The catalyst for change. Naomi woke up to the soft rays of sunlight streaming through her bedroom window. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of clarity and resolve. The events of the past week had been emotionally draining, but they had also ignited something bigger than herself. As she sipped her morning tea, she opened her laptop to review the latest developments. The email inbox was filled with more media inquiries, notes of support, and updates from her legal team. One email, however, stood out. It was from Clara, the young flight attendant who had reached out previously. Subject: Progress Update. Dear Mrs. Price, I wanted to let you know that things are starting to change here at Horizon Air. The internal conversations have been difficult but necessary. Mandatory diversity and de-escalation training sessions have already been scheduled for all crew members, and management is emphasizing accountability like never before. I just wanted you to know that your voice has already made a difference. Thank you for standing up, not just for yourself, but for all of us. Warm regards, Clara. Naomi's lips curved into a faint smile. Clara's message was a small reminder that change, while slow, was possible. She forwarded the email to Mia with a short note. Let's keep the momentum going. 2 weeks later, Naomi found herself in the heart of Washington, D.C., standing before a packed congressional hearing. What had started as an isolated incident on Flight 883 had evolved into a national conversation about systemic discrimination in corporate America. Lawmakers, advocacy groups, and airline executives had gathered to discuss what had gone wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. Naomi had been invited to testify as the centerpiece of the hearing. Her experience had become a symbol of both the problem and the potential for progress. As she adjusted the microphone, she scanned the room, taking in the weight of the moment. Cameras from major news outlets lined the back wall, their lenses trained on her. Reporters scribbled in notepads, while lawmakers whispered among themselves. Naomi began speaking, her voice calm and steady. Good morning. My name is Naomi Price. I am here today not just as someone who experienced discrimination, but as someone who believes in the power of accountability and systemic change. What happened to me on Flight 883 was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger issue, a culture of implicit bias and unchecked assumptions that permeates our institutions. She paused, letting her words settle over the room. This isn't just about Horizon Air. It's about the systems that allow incidents like this to happen, again and again, without consequence. It's about ensuring that every person, regardless of their race, gender, or socioeconomic background, is treated with dignity and respect. The room was silent, hanging on her every word. Naomi continued, laying out clear, actionable recommendations, stronger anti-discrimination policies, accountability measures tied to executive performance, and mandatory, recurring training programs that went beyond surface-level diversity initiatives. By the time she finished, the room erupted in applause, not the polite kind reserved for formal proceedings, but the genuine, heartfelt kind that carried the weight of agreement and admiration. Behind closed doors, while Naomi's testimony was galvanizing, the airline executives in attendance were keenly aware of the stakes. Horizon Air's CEO, Margaret Yates, sat among them, taking detailed notes. She had already implemented internal reforms, but Naomi's demands had made it clear that more was expected, not just from her airline, but from the industry as a whole. After the hearing, Margaret approached Naomi in the hallway. "Mrs. Price," she said, her tone genuine, "I want to thank you for your courage. Your testimony was powerful, and I want you to know that Horizon Air is committed to being part of the solution." Naomi nodded, her expression firm but not unkind. "Words are a start, but actions are what matter. I'll be watching." "You'll see results," Margaret promised, "and I hope you'll continue to hold us accountable." The broader movement. In the months that followed, Naomi's experience became a touchstone for a larger movement. Horizon Air introduced sweeping reforms, including transparent reporting of discrimination complaints and partnerships with civil rights organizations to audit their practices. Other airlines followed suit, spurred by the public pressure and the fear of similar scandals. Naomi, meanwhile, became an advocate for change beyond the airline industry. She was invited to speak at conferences, join panels, and consult with corporations on creating inclusive cultures. Despite the attention, she remained grounded, always returning to the simple motivation that had driven her from the start: a better future for her daughter and others like her. Amara, now more aware of the world around her, often accompanied her mother to events. She didn't fully understand the gravity of what Naomi had accomplished, but she sensed its importance. "You're really brave, Moni," she said one day, after watching Naomi speak to a packed auditorium. Naomi knelt down and hugged her daughter tightly. "I do it for you, sweetheart, so you can grow up in a world that's kinder and fairer." A closing note. One evening, Naomi received a handwritten letter in the mail. The return address was unfamiliar. As she opened it, she realized it was from Linda Blake, the flight attendant who had triggered the incident. "Dear Mrs. Price, I don't know if this letter will mean anything to you, but I felt compelled to write it. I've spent the past few months reflecting on my actions, and I've come to understand just how wrong I was. I made assumptions about you that were rooted in ignorance, and I hurt you in ways I can't take back. I've since left Horizon Air, but I've also committed myself to doing better. I started attending anti-bias workshops and volunteering with organizations that promote equity. I know that doesn't erase what I did, but I hope it shows that I'm trying to learn and grow. Thank you for your grace and strength. You've inspired me to be better. Sincerely, Linda Blake." Naomi read the letter twice, her emotions conflicted. She didn't respond immediately, but she folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Forgiveness, she thought, was a process, not just for Linda, but for herself. The legacy. As the anniversary of the Flight 883 incident approached, Naomi reflected on the journey it had taken her on. What had begun as a moment of humiliation and pain had transformed into a movement for accountability and change. She had turned her silence into a voice, her frustration into action, and her experience into a catalyst. And while the world was far from perfect, Naomi knew that it was better than it had been. One flight, one incident, one voice had made a difference. And for Naomi, that was enough. A new horizon. The world moved forward, as it always does, but the ripples of Naomi Price's experience on Flight 883 continued to spread. Months turned into a year, and the anniversary of the incident was marked not by controversy but by progress. Horizon Air had transformed in ways that even the most skeptical observers couldn't ignore. Margaret Yates, true to her word, had pushed for meaningful reforms, including Passenger Advocacy Council, a group composed of customers, civil rights advocates, and airline staff to address complaints and shape policy changes. Transparency reports, quarterly updates on discrimination complaints, resolution processes, and internal audits. Bias training overhaul, a curriculum developed in collaboration with leading equity organizations, with training mandatory for every employee. Zero tolerance policy, clear guidelines for disciplinary action against employees who violated the airline's anti-discrimination policies. These changes weren't just corporate buzzwords, they were felt in the day-to-day operations of the airline. Complaints of bias decreased, employee satisfaction improved, and Horizon Air became a model for the industry. The award ceremony. Naomi stood in a bustling banquet hall, surrounded by some of the most influential figures in the fields of law, activism, and corporate reform. She had been invited to receive the Courage and Advocacy Award, a recognition of her efforts to turn a personal injustice into a nationwide movement. Marcus stood by her side, his hand resting gently on her back. "You ready?" he asked, his voice warm with pride. Naomi smiled at him. "As ready as I'll ever be." The host introduced her, recounting the story of Flight 883 and the incredible change it had inspired. As Naomi walked to the podium, the audience rose to their feet, their applause thunderous. She paused for a moment, taking it all in, before beginning her speech. "This award isn't about me," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It's about the countless people who have faced similar situations, people whose stories didn't go viral, whose voices weren't heard. This is for them, for all of us." She spoke of the importance of accountability, the power of collective action, and the enduring need to challenge systems of inequality. By the time she finished, there were tears in the eyes of many in the audience. Closure. Weeks after the ceremony, Naomi sat in her living room with Amara, who was now 7 years old. They were flipping through a photo album, filled with memories of the past year, panels, meetings, interviews, and moments of quiet triumph. "Mommy, do you think that lady from the plane is still mean?" Amara asked suddenly, her tone curious rather than accusatory. Naomi thought for a moment. "I don't think she's mean, sweetheart. I think she didn't understand what she was doing. But I hope she's learning to be better." Amara nodded solemnly. "You helped her learn." Naomi smiled. "Maybe. Sometimes people need someone to show them a better way." That evening, Naomi took out Linda Blake's letter again. She hadn't responded before, but now she felt ready. Sitting at her desk, she began to write. "Dear Ms. Blake, thank you for your letter. I appreciate the courage it must have taken to write it. Acknowledging our mistakes is never easy, but it's the first step toward change. I accept your apology, and I'm glad to hear that you're working toward being part of the solution. I believe we all have the capacity to grow, and I hope you continue on that path. Take care. Naomi Price." As Naomi sealed the envelope, she felt a sense of closure, not just with Linda, but with the incident as a whole. What had started as a moment of pain and humiliation had transformed into something far greater, a movement, a legacy, a testament to resilience. The final flight. Months later, Naomi and Amara boarded another flight, this time to celebrate Marcus's birthday in Hawaii. As they settled into their seats in first class, Amara leaned toward her mother. "Do you think anyone will bother us this time?" she asked, her voice light but serious. Naomi chuckled, her eyes sparkling. "I don't think so, sweetheart. And if they do, we'll handle it, just like we always do." The flight attendant approached with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard, Mrs. Price. Can I get you and your daughter anything to start your journey?" Naomi smiled back. "Just water. Thank you." As the plane took off, Naomi gazed out the window at the clouds below, feeling a deep sense of peace. The world wasn't perfect, but it was better. And for her, that was worth everything.